All right. Hit and go live. All righty. All righty, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see you all out there on a Thursday here live, 1 p.m. Eastern for This Week in Drones, another live stream of our amazing panelists. And we have a special guest today. And it's our good friend Sean over with Energy Drone and Robotics Coalition hosting the Energy Drone Robotics Conference next week that a bunch of folks from our team are going to be heading out to. Sean, thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Excited to be with y'all. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, we'll do a little round of introductions, but I did want to let you guys know out there, I really wanted Sean to be on right before the event coming up. It's going to be in Houston, but it's pretty incredible this year. I'll let Sean share. I won't steal his thunder, but it's really expanded. It's really grown. Josh and I went out last year, and we're sending more folks this year, and it really gives our audience out there a really tuned perspective on the energy sector, oil and gas, robotics in general. But there's, for us, that tie-in, is really like what is going on in that market regarding drones, using drones for operations, for inspections, out at oil refineries and all sorts of substations and different elements there in that energy sector. But then what's been really growing, and we're going to ask Sean some questions about what he's seeing in that market, is the counter UAS, drone detection. I'm sure conversations about mitigation. I'm sure conversations about, how do we put flight restrictions over our airspace? What does that even mean? What does that look like? So we're talking like all of that's opened up since even last year, right? And I'll let Sean share more, but that whole world suddenly is not only focused on, primarily on, how do we operate our drones, but the conference has expanded tremendously to include a huge focus on counter UAS. So probably not a surprise to everybody out there listening in. Richard, nice to see you. Richard Reynolds, shout out. But with that, David Lewin, yours truly here at Echodyne, covering the East for everything, related to SLTT, whether it's, ports, airports, electric utilities that are needing radars to see everything that's aloft, right? So that's my quick intro. I'll pass it to Josh to Wes, and then Wes to our special guest, Sean, if you don't mind.
Everybody, great to see you again. Joshua Lewin here with Echodyne, covering the West, doing all some great stuff David's doing. Really excited to go to Energy Drone Robotics this year. There's been a lot of energy, as it were, in this space, especially with a lot of the conflicts around the world and people using drones in nefarious ways, but also really amazing ways. It's been a great conversation. I'm looking forward to having it.
Thanks, Josh. Howdy, y'all. I'm Wes Morrison. I've just recently joined Echodyne after 13 years being at AUVSI, so where I worked with a lot of companies in this space and stakeholders across the autonomy ecosystem. But here at Echodyne, I'll be representing the ground-based detect and avoid technology, and I'll be focused on building those partnerships, supporting ground-based detect and avoid solutions for critical infrastructure and civil applications. Very excited to be seeing a lot of the friendly faces next week at the EDR Summit. So looking forward to seeing what Sean has in store. And with that, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it, Wes, and congrats on the new role. So excited to talk to you all about the 10th anniversary, believe it or not, 10th anniversary Energy Drone and Robotics Summit. So it's our annual meeting. And I would say definitely it's the industry is doing very well. It's meeting the moment, and this will be our largest event in the history of the 10 years. So we're excited about that. And as you mentioned at the top of the discussion, David, there's so much happening. I mean, it's just, there's so much to unpack that, I mean, when we looked at it and went to our industry advisory board, we ended up almost doubling the content from what we had just a year ago in order to get all the speakers and panels and case studies and demos to fit all the different areas that are growing simultaneously. And when you look at BVLOS, you look at counter UAS, you look at just the growth of scaling in regular, surveying, mapping, inspection operations, and then the interoperability with all the different robots from aerial to ground to subsurface. And then another piece that became a whole conference unto itself, just the data, just the data and making it actionable is now a complete conference that we hold at the same time. So our industrial intelligence track. So it's kind of crazy to think about how much it's developed. It's like fast and slow time, right? You see that all the time. It's fast and slow time. It seemed like it took forever to get to here. And now that we're here, it's moving so fast.
Big time. Oh man, that's so cool. So out of curiosity, if you can name kind of some of the types of folks that are coming, that are hungry, that are like the actual, sorts of utilities that are coming to learn, I think that would be pretty interesting for context for folks. But with that said, I'd love to hear what you're seeing with the rise of counter UAS, right? You're saying suddenly it's like a whole track. It's like a half day now just assigned to what do we do about protecting our utilities from the threat of drones. We see that at some conferences, right? We've talked about it on this podcast plenty of times, but it's unique to the Energy, Drone, and Robotics Conference, right? That was primarily, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think primarily focused on enabling drones. And then suddenly a really decent percentage of the conference is now taken up with this focus of what do we do about drones that we don't want to be there, and how do we defend against them? And it sounds like there's actually more titles of folks coming that are more in the security world, not just the operations side of the house. So I guess tell us a little bit about that growth you're seeing, but also what are you hearing in the market? What would be interesting to folks that are tuning in here to hear about that, is shifting in the conversations you're having? What are the concerns you're hearing? Just anything, anywhere you want to take that, just to kind of banter on that for a minute.
Sure, happy to. So what we'll do is let's work backwards. So we'll unpack the last piece around the growth of the security and counter UAS, and then we'll jump backwards to talk more broadly about the asset owner operators' perspectives and who's coming to share and participate. So starting with security counter UAS, it's as obvious as you said, the geopolitics that are out there. So what was happening certainly between Ukraine and Russia started to bring it up. But if you notice in the last 12 months, to 18 months, a lot more energy assets are being, implicated in these, and unfortunately having incidents around the war. So you have that issue that started to bring that up. Then, of course, what happened in the Middle East started immediately with energy assets, many of which are partnerships with some of the super majors who are part of the Energy, Drone, Robotics Coalition. So even though it's foreign assets, it's domestic companies that suddenly have an interest. Then you take on top of that, back to the utility side, the New Jersey sightings. You have a variety of substation and transmission incidents where there's definitely, I would say, evidence of surveillance and or some test penetration being done with drones. So you have that situation, which then starts to put forth DHS and NERC and other regulatory bodies putting out warnings, putting out different edicts, so that certainly makes people wonder. And then encompassing all that now, you have moving legislation that's moving into, proposed rulemaking around critical infrastructure and what they may or may not be able to do. So suddenly you're broadening potentially the scope from identification and tracking to potentially mitigation and some other areas that historically have not been the case, whether that's a public-private partnership or with different agencies, or whether they'll have some aspect of it that they'll be able to control themselves. So that then moves across the field to your players. Physical security directors are now interested in this area, as well as the UAS leaders who've always been interested, from utilities and pipelines and oil and gas, as you said, for more regular, I would say, reasons for good. Inspection, surveying, and mapping was their reason for safety and efficiency and making things safer for their people and being able to get data quicker. Now they're having to merge that with what they need to be keeping out or tracking. And so you have both scaling internally and you have these external potential threats that they have to keep track of. So that's bringing a really large coalition of folks to the table around just counter UAS. And I could say, for instance, Entergy and Duke Energy are going to be sharing. We have folks coming from API, American Petroleum Institute, AFPM, the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers, which is your refineries and petrochemical, as well as from EPRI, who represents a lot of the large utilities. So their folks are coming to talk about specifically counter UAS and how they're members. So we have both individual asset owners as well as organizations that represent the asset owners coming to talk about all this. So I'll pause there, but it's a lot of folks coming together at the same time. And then on top of that, all the folks from our traditional audience who would be coming to about scaling their programs and talking about BVLOS and other things. And that represents lots of utilities from, Florida Power and Light and NextEra, Duke, Southern California Edison, PG&E, Entergy, Vistra. I mean, we just have a whole lot. And then a bunch of the regional co-ops are coming this year. So we're getting down, I think, into levels of folks who we've never seen before. And we're really excited to have them come and share.
That's awesome. Out of curiosity, in the conversations that you've been seeing happening amongst these kind of large groups, a lot of times with counter UAS particularly, it can be challenging for one group to necessarily put up the resources to like cover, an entire region or to, protect, they want to protect one or two assets. But it seems like a lot of this technology would be interoperable, where you could have, the technology that one group has, another group could utilize that to protect their sites as well. Have you seen conversations around like public-private partnerships or like coalitions of groups come together to help protect kind of like mutual, areas where there might be mutual assets, or has there been any conversation that you've seen around that piece?
Yeah, it's a great point, Josh. And so you have a couple different aspects of that. Certainly, anytime you're talking about energy infrastructure, there's a huge public connection to that, right? From different agencies, whether it's local or regional or national. And so there definitely is a lot of discussion going back on public-private. And that's, I think, one of the complete session is covering just that aspect of it. And so you do see that. And I think a lot of that came together outside of energy, most recently around FIFA and the World Cup. You've got all these different destinations. Prior to that, it was more like Super Bowl, but these large gatherings that certainly create potential targets that they needed to look at what they're doing on counter UAS and surveillance and detection. And so I think it started there, and that's kind of migrated now to the energy critical infrastructure. And those are almost all public-private type partnerships where they're working together. And then I think in the private side for the energy and utility companies, we're looking at a situation that's rapidly developing. That's obviously, these are critical assets, as the name implies. And so they have to protect them. And that's a big impact if something does happen. So they're really having to vet the technology very carefully, because these are large investments. This is not inexpensive to stand up a layered airspace detection mitigation system. And so they're really having to gather that data and move across that ground very quickly. So I think anything they can glean from the public partnerships, that works. And then also sharing with each other, because these are such large investments. And there's a lot of different technologies that could be applied, and likely more than one would be for their various assets.
I mean, with that said, I'll just shout out again, if anyone is up for coming and having these conversations next week in Houston, you should go attend. You should come out and say hi to us, to Sean, and we can pick up these conversations. But also, see if you're available Tuesday, Wednesday. I believe, what you said, Wednesday, like 8:30 to 1, good half day is going to be fully focused on all these panels and folks. I think you mentioned Duke, some others that are going to be presenting and talking about counter UAS and what's coming, what we've seen in the past, what we're looking at right now, and some of the legislation and some of the things coming in, up next. So it could be a really good opportunity for lead generation, but also like coming to like inform the market and learn, so we can move together, right? Because even up to like 6 months ago, a year ago, maybe, the electric utility market was really adamant about like, hey, why would we even detect a drone if we're not allowed to do anything about it if we see it, right? That was something that I'd hear quite often. And I feel that that's matured. And, if anything, the water sector is now saying that, like they're like now at the table from my experience. And now they're saying that, why would we detect if we can't do anything about it? But the energy sector has moved on that spectrum towards actually starting to become proactive. And this is just an anecdote from, my world, and what I'm hearing and seeing. But I feel like the energy sector, and I don't know what NERC is doing exactly, but I think they're starting to embrace, starting to roll out, starting to get more serious and proactively invest in counter UAS technology. So it is actually incredibly timely to be out there in Houston together, meet up with some of these folks, pick up where you left off with one of them. And, I think they're kind of a hot market right now, ready. Like they need help, and they know they need it now, and they're embracing it. I guess with that said, kind of a springboard into another topic I'd be curious to hear about. And Wes, if you have comments on this from your AUVSI perspective, coming from that world where you worked with a lot of these same end users, right? Like, what are we seeing upcoming? What do they anticipate right now? Like, in terms of 2209, Section 2209, right? With maybe the capability of adding flight restrictions over some of their facilities. Is that of interest? Is that a concern? Is that something that they're looking at? Because a lot of folks are like, hey, is it even illegal for someone to fly over our property when the FAA owns the airspace? Well, we see coming down the pipe, 10 years later, we're going to hopefully see Section 2209 really get implemented. And the energy sector, I think, is going to be a group that's going to benefit. So what are you guys seeing for that? Airspace restrictions? What are you seeing for just kind of second piece of the same question is like mitigation, the capability, for them to maybe do something, quote unquote, about the drone if they see it. So I'll leave it there for either of you guys to jump in. And hey, Scott Gross, good to see you. And the other folks in the comments, but shout out to Scott. He says situational awareness is the key for the utilities, and he's a man that would know from his days. But yeah, all right, I'll leave it to you guys. Wes, you came off mute. Maybe you want to jump in?
Yeah, coming from the world of AUVSI, our day-to-day activities were to advocate and help shape the regulations that go into making the use for these drones and the counter applications. A lot of the questions that we got from the end users in the infrastructure or the utilities market is like, why detect if I can't do anything about it? And like the FAA restrictions to those limits. So, we'll be curious, Sean, like what kind of topics are you guys going to have next week at the show that kind of address some of those concerns and how to be more proactive in the detecting of these drone opportunities and threats versus being reactive?
Yeah, it's a great point. And AUVSI does a wonderful job, certainly on the policy and, helping get the voices of the industry out there on that perspective for all different areas like security and counter UAS. So what we're going to try to do really, the plan based on what we built is to really unpack for people what is the regulatory landscape as we look at all these different areas, what's already done, what are these warnings or different notices mean, and then what's potentially coming and when and why. So in other words, we spend a lot of time looking at that. Then we get into the landscape, right? Because you can't, so you have to figure out the why, I think, is more around regulatory, geopolitics, what's happening and what could be happening. Then the what is, okay, what are all these technologies? What is a layered defense? So getting them educated at the same time. And like any situation, some of them are going to be further advanced. Some of them are just entering the conversation. So we've got to get that unpacked for them so they can get a good understanding of the technology and how it does or doesn't work together. Because we talked about earlier, such big investments. And then the last piece of it is, all right, today, what does your playbook look like then? So what does it look like to build out your identification, your tracking, to make sure you've got that part down solid that is acceptable? And then what is it you need to be doing to get ready for the next stage, which is a lot of what we've covered in the past, back when we did part 107 10 years ago, and now part 108, which is imminent, soon to be. So you look at it that it's like, what can you do today and versus what technologies you might need to add to the conversation? And then what do you need to get ready for? So we're doing that all over again now for 108 for the energy and utility sector, just like we did back when the first Round came to Part 107 10 years ago, and BVLOS started to pick up as far as possible operations and waivers. So I think counter UAS is running the same way. Wes, is basically that's the pattern, that they have to get that kind of knowledge base to really be able to be ready for the next step.
Yeah, absolutely. As education, addresses the threats around this particular sector around critical infrastructure, definitely helps operators adapt more quickly for future use cases. It's knowledge is power in that sense.
So curious what you're hearing, Sean. Is anyone talking about mitigation or like taking the drone out of the sky or something to that effect? And is anybody talking about airspace, some sort of UAFR, flight restrictions for unmanned aerial vehicles over their property? Are those hot topics, or what are you hearing?
Yeah, they are hot topics from various perspectives. So let's just take a look. You have multiple stakeholders in every situation, right? So we have to take a look at, depending on where you are in the stakeholders, as to what is probably more of interest. So let's kind of unpack that. So starting with the first part of, they were more or less interested, but as these areas shifted so rapidly, that interest level went up across all stakeholders. So whether you're a technology solution provider, whether you're a service company who helps operate drones for the asset owners for the areas they need, survey, mapping, inspection, do you have an interest level because you're operating around critical infrastructure? So how do you get plugged into their identification and tracking? And then you have the asset owner themselves, and their job is to protect that asset, manage that asset, many times producing some form of energy that's critical for the public. So you basically have each of those that I think are heightened awareness, and their interest level is starting to go up dramatically. Then the next level has got to be, let's go back to that regulatory, right? So we go back to the regulatory, that's got potential pros and cons, just like people will tell you about Part 108 and BVLOS. There, I don't want to call it winners and losers, but there are people will be impacted. So there are people, if critical infrastructure starts to get certain designations and certain capabilities, will that make it harder for service companies to do some of the work that they've been doing around critical assets, or people who are doing other work that are nearby? So drone pilots may have some challenges because, can I operate in this area that I formerly did? I'm not talking hobbyist, all commercial here, obviously, for our crowd. But, so I think there's some questions there about what's going to be beneficial, for the most possible within stakeholder community. And then I think when it comes to the last aspect, the technology you're talking about, we have to take a look at that when we move to mitigation, right? That was your specific question. Are people considering mitigation? Yes, they are. But let's take a look at it. Like a lot of technology that has been proven and works well is around RF, right? Radio frequency. So if you start to move from detection identification, you start to move into some of those areas. Well, things that are being done in other areas, Middle East, or once again, back to Ukraine, Russia, there's a lot around radio frequency, blocking, masking, all sorts of different techniques. Well, a lot of the equipment that you operate in sophisticated and complex petrochemical refining utilities is radio frequency operated. So to suddenly have something that stops that for a drone that potentially could impact your operations, you have to look at, what does that mean? How do you take over that drone? Where is it going to land? How are you going to make sure it doesn't impact current operations? And then how are you not going to impact the other items that you're running, valves, pumps, meters, that are radio frequency signals, that those sensors are sending that data to a control room to help them very safely and efficiently operate that asset. So you have a lot of pieces there when you start to move to mitigation. That starts to become kind of a question beyond the regulatory, which is not there yet. So, I think there's a lot of technology questions, and I think that those potential impacts add a lot to the mix, which probably goes back to your point, probably why energy and utilities have been maybe a little slower in the adoption curve versus some of the other stakeholders, because they do have to be very careful.
That's well said. And back to Wes's comment about knowledge being power, this is their opportunity gathering in Houston next week to get that education, to vet out what's available today. Is it, from the radars that Echodyne produces that have that high quality detection and alert, hey, there's a threat, to what you're talking about, if it's RF, jamming, or like cyber takeover that's maybe more surgical, or even kinetic, even in fact, our radar system can detect and point another, like a kinetic drone, net capture drone, to go out and tell it, at least where in space, the threat is coming from, so it can go and get its own targeting on it and go take it out with a net and capture it more safely. So there's a whole spectrum there. FIFA World Cup is going to be a very interesting, a very interesting testing proving ground for all these technologies, from our radar systems to all sorts of mitigation technologies. And of course, the FBI Training Center has been able to train a handful of state law enforcement agents and kind of deputize them to be able to administer some of the mitigation technology, right? And so that authority is being kind of extended as we speak. So we'll see how that all rolls out after the World Cup, and I kind of banter around that because we're gonna have a lot of lessons learned as a whole, as an industry, coming off of the World Cup into next week, literally. But then another few weeks after that, in the next month or two, we'll have a lot of after action on how did this technology work in the urban environment in these combinations, and where can there be public-private partnerships where technology is already being deployed, has already been purchased for the World Cup and for the FEMA round 2, funding that's going to be more widespread. Is there an electric utility or a refinery that might be somewhere in the vicinity of a law enforcement agency that's maybe deputized now to use mitigation, that maybe has equipment, and you can start to maybe as an industry hopefully start to piece together some of these public-private partnerships, which is something, Sean, that you mentioned before we went live, that we could get into here, which is like, it's going to take a village. It's going to, not only to educate, but also to determine, like, where is all this equipment being deployed around your refinery? Maybe it already exists. Maybe there's a connection there. One of the guests, Shane Riley, just pointed out Olympics 28. That's going to be another kind of flywheel into, how do we protect these mass gatherings from drones? And so, anyways, a lot, maybe my soapbox there a little bit, just to say there are a lot of stakeholders. There's a lot of equipment going out today. There is mitigation authority being extended today. There's all these things are kind of in flux and being lightly, kind of deployed, in real time deployed, and perhaps scaled, perhaps in the next year or 2 or 3, however that looks, we may be able to actually really see some more wide adoption of some of these technologies and techniques. So I think it's just opportune time right now to make sure that we're in a consensus as an industry as to like what the right technologies are, right, to deploy. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox.
Yeah, I think one thing you mentioned, Sean, that I think might be interesting to kind of look at a little bit more is this kind of dynamic between security but also enablement. And we had chatted a little bit about potentially having some of those no-fly zones around some of these critical sites, which might affect some of their own, doing surveying and things like that. But on the other side of the coin, you also have maybe police wanting to use that airspace, or medical groups wanting to do medical deliveries, or even Walmart and Amazon doing drone delivery. Where do you see, is there a lot of cross kind of industry conversation around how this airspace is going to function? Because there's kind of like the Swiss cheese airspace where all the critical sites are all closed off, but then there's the open airspace where everybody's kind of going everywhere, and it kind of can cause a lot of chaos. Have you seen a lot of that kind of conversation, or do you kind of have some insight there?
I do have some insight. I always like to tell everybody as a preface when I'm conversing as director of the Energy Drone Robotics Coalition, my knowledge is about 1 mile wide and 1 inch deep, as we say in Texas. So we certainly have some great experts coming next week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in Houston, to really unpack this at a much deeper level. But my understanding to what both of y'all were talking about is, a lot of this is going to get covered around federal roles, boundaries, certification pathways, safer skies, right? Safer skies is going to be part of it. that initiative, the SLTT, law enforcement agencies, building coordination frameworks. I mean, these are all going to, I don't think it's going to be the Swiss cheese, I guess, to get, to push me off the fence. I don't think it'll be that way. I think it has to be unified. People have to be able to understand, just like whether it's an airport or a pipeline or what have you, where and how do you operate? And there's a lot of drones that are going to be wanting to operate in that space. So you got to come up with ways that work for everybody. And you can't, I think, have a public agency, to your point, David, that has the ability to take something down over critical infrastructure and critical infrastructure not involved. These have got to be situations where you have some level of understanding, network, UTM, when we talk about the different airspace things that are coming out. I think all that's got to get tied into it. And it seems like those initiatives, Safer Skies is one, that they are positioning that way, that these will be unified, because you're going to have people operating in urban, suburban, and rural, and around all kinds of different assets.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned something that made me think of another topic, which is insurance, and how if you've heard anything from the insurance industry, it's kind of one of Josh's threads that he likes to pull, which is just, do you foresee that insurance companies will underwrite, will look at potentially, drone, I want to say mitigating the drone threat, but that's just too strong of a word in this industry, but, tackling the drone threat in their security posture as a way to maybe reduce rates or manage rates that may perhaps would go up, at the concern of the threat of drones. And is that something to educate the market on, or is that a potential business kind of opportunity, a way to look at justifying, cost of purchasing equipment, or what's your take on that? Or are we, kind of barking down the wrong trail on that one?
Well, you've definitely gone more than an inch deep on my knowledge on that. But I know that we could take a look at operations that involve drones already, right? So if we look at, there are drones operating, and they obviously have, whether it's a service company or the teams that are operating them on behalf or as actual employees of an asset owner, there are insurance implications to any time you're operating around critical infrastructure. Both, I would say probably, adding insurance coverage that has to happen around that. And potentially, if you have a solid SMS, right, safety management system, if you have a good guidelines as an asset owner for, how to fly, et cetera, that probably helps reduce, I would imagine. But I don't know that for a fact that, but I know insurance is obviously required. I know that also there's reasons to safely operate, of course, but also could impact insurance. And then I would add, probably some of the groundwork has been laid for this. If you think about terrorist threat insurance, right? If you think about all the different
Safety Act, almost compliance, or things
exactly.
Like that.
So some of that already has to be laid out as to what happens if a nefarious actor does something that impacts whether it's an office building or a power plant. What happens? Who's at fault? Who's, what's the risk? And, do we do something to mitigate that? And I think they're trying to definitely move up to the detect and identify side is becoming very high, and mitigation likely will. I think Shane puts in a great personal opinion here in our comments. The vast majority of this will get solved with expanded use case testing between the FAA, universities, and industry partners. And that type of coalition is exactly what's going to solve most of this. And I'm sure insurance, though, to your point, will definitely be part of it.
Yeah, I'm no insurance expert, but I know, the more drone and counter UAS programs become more mature, like that signals operational maturity in a sense as well. So that'll give those insurers confidence to evaluate, similar to what they do for cybersecurity, just based off some of the conversations I've had with those communities and end users in the past.
And not to mention with Section 2209 with the FAA eventually being rolled out, in order to get flight restrictions over a critical asset, there's a pretty robust requirement for, showing your whole layered approach to security for the ground and the air, right? Showing that you've done a level of assessing, risk assessment, like an actual program, security program. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of the folks you work with, Sean, are under compliance with NERC and FERC, and NERC 14 and everything to actually have like detailed compliance, against certain like requirements or standards even. But I think that's a factor. Like if you want to get a flight restriction, you need to have an actual robust program that you can back up. You can't just like send in a piece of paper and say, I need one. You actually have to be able to show the FAA, if you give me a flight restriction, I'm going to be able to manage it, essentially. I'm going to be able to incorporate it into my response plan, into my technology, into my alerting, etc. Right?
Yeah, you can think of it like a flip side of a coin, right, David? So in essence, you have Part 108 and BVLOS, which is moving some of the things off of the individual pilot to the company, right? So you basically are having to prove that you have what it takes. And that's how most of the waivers have been occurring, right? Under 107, you're proving that you have the right technology, the right radars, the right teams to not need a visual line of sight observer, what have you. And so it's kind of like, that's the way you get to extend your current operations. And then the flip side, you look at 2209 and some of those things, you're going to have similar types of, plans and technology that prove you can control and identify around critical infrastructure and operate in a safe manner. So you look at both of those are FAA, initiatives that you're going to have to enable. And I think that's where large power and utility and oil and gas and pipeline companies are going to be ready to meet that challenge.
That's good. Josh?
Yeah, out of curiosity, Sean, are there any industry groups or companies that you feel like are really leading the charge right now that would be worth kind of looking at? Or I know there'll be some folks speaking at your event or at the event coming up, but are there any ones that you've had conversations with that are doing really exciting things that, I mean, obviously now we'll talk about all of it, but just name some highlights.
Yeah, great question, Josh. So always have to be very, very careful here to continue to keep my Switzerland type behavior, because we work with so many different companies that are solution providers within the ecosystem. And we do want to make sure that we give all of them a kind of an equal platform so that energy asset owners can make informed decisions. So what we tend to talk about more at the coalition, whether it's the summit that's happening next week or our newsletters every week, or even in our LinkedIn channels and other areas that we do digitally, what we really try to do is make sure people understand, how do you vet the technologies, right? And what are the best practices? And certainly they bring them together, the asset owners, so that they can have those conversations, which probably aren't on the stage, but more in the foyer, about individual companies. But here's some broad strokes that I think help everybody, which is when you look at technologies that are potential, and when you have a area of growth like counter UAS, you have a lot more technologies entering, and you don't necessarily know. So you always want to look at, how long have they been in this market? How many deployments do they have in related areas of critical infrastructure, like maybe with FIFA or for a large thing like the Olympics or what have you? What have they been doing? How have they been deployed? What have the results been from that? And, try to gain from that. And I think energy and utilities are very careful still and likely to do that. And particularly, have you deployed for an energy or utility company anywhere in the world? That would be very, I think, high interest. Birds of a feather like to flock together. So I think you definitely will see people have certain technologies, whether that's radar or RF mitigation or some sort of kinetic even down the road. I think it's going to be what's proven. And energy and utility often don't want to be your first customer, but they'll line up behind someone who's already done one or two deployments successfully. And the other advantage you have with energy and utility asset owners, they have lots of assets. So if you could prove it for one substation or one transmission line section or generation for a utility, well, they got a whole lot more. So once they become a buyer and a user, they buy a lot. And so that's kind of the upside, maybe a slower cycle to get in, but once you're in, I think it can expand a lot. So I think that's the best thing, is to say you have to look at the technologies carefully. And yes, I recognize that I'm still standing on my fence. I'm not going to jump on either side, just to be careful. I don't want to leave someone out.
100%. That's great, man. Well, I guess, for anyone who joined late, Sean, do you want to just share, again, just like a brief overview of what's going down next week, what it is, how to learn more about it, the types of folks that are coming, just kind of another quick overview for folks. I think it'd be really helpful. I'd love to see a bunch of the faces of the virtual folks that are dialoguing with us right now, down there.
That'd be great. We'd love to have them. You bet. Sure, David. So what we're looking at is we're going to bring together about 2,000 folks in Houston next Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday for our annual summit, 10th anniversary. And they represent oil and gas, pipeline, utility companies, and the service companies who work with them, and of course the solution providers. And they're going to be talking about all the different ways they're utilizing drones and robots and data and AI to run their operations and to protect their assets and to inspect their assets. And they're going to be talking about all of that. So we have a couple hundred speakers, and we're looking forward to having people come out. And in this particular area around energy security, counter UAS, we have a half-day forum on Wednesday, June 24th, where the physical security directors and the UAV and robotics leaders can all come together to talk about both perimeter and airspace security for assets. And everybody is welcome in the industry. We look forward to it. I recognize a lot of people who are visiting with us today digitally. Same thing. Come to edrcoalition.com. We have almost everything we do eventually becomes digital, and there's ways for you to be able to visit with that, or you can visit on one of our digital channels like LinkedIn or our weekly newsletter and stay in the loop. We have almost 20,000 members of the EDR Coalition. As I mentioned, only a couple thousand of them come face-to-face from around the world next week.
That's great. That's awesome. I just pulled it up myself. Looks, I don't know if I can share it on here, but I'd like to. I don't know if I can.
From the Echodyne team, myself and Josh will be there. David might even be making a guest appearance. So if you see us, wave us down. Happy to have a conversation. Love to make the connection.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks everyone for your time. Thank you so much, Sean. Love having you here. I'm sure we'll have you back if you'll take us, and we'll have some good in-person conversations next week.
Honored to be with you all today, and great to talk to everybody online, and look forward to seeing everybody face to face who can make it, and let's stay in touch.
Awesome.